What's the haps? I'm Meroka, and my pronouns are they and them. I wonder how many of you knew that already. I've not advertised the fact explicitly, I've been dancing around the subject for a little while now, but my co-streamers have certainly mentioned it on occasion. Well, there we go, I guess this is a coming out video of sorts. I'm non-binary. I guess some of you won't know what that is exactly, so a very quick primer. It's a little bit like being transgender. It means I don't identify as either a man or a woman. Some people classify it as being a type of transgender, some don't. It means different things to different people, and they present themselves to the world in different ways, but the upshot is that the labels man and woman and other words associated with such things, including pronouns, don't usually sit well with non-binary or NB folks. Even that's not universal, some are fine with he or she pronouns, some use any. I'm particularly fond of they, them, it just kind of feels right. And that's all it is, it's just what kind of feels right for any given person, and basic respect for other people's wishes. Bill Nye had a really good simple explanation of these concepts that I'll link in the description if you're feeling a bit lost and want to learn more. At any rate, my intention today is not to talk about gender identities specifically, or whether they're valid. In no small part because I already made a video last year about this as it pertained to Temtem at the time. Nor is it specifically about coming out. That's very relevant, but also tangential. I want to talk about representation and why it matters. You may have heard the expression representation matters before. It's a good quick soundbite, an expression of solidarity, but often doesn't get to the heart of things. It certainly doesn't explain much to anyone who fits into what society has deemed to be the norm as to why it matters to folks who don't. I've championed queer representation in my work more heavily over the past year or two while coming to understand my own sexuality and gender, but that's not to say queer representation is the only kind. There are plenty of underrepresented groups who benefit from being portrayed in media. Black and minority ethnicities continue to be underrepresented, and when was the last time you saw indigenous peoples portrayed well? The internet ever increasingly allows individuals and small teams options to self-publish work, so independent spaces are great for finding all this kind of stuff, but the mainstream is more often than not found lacking. Anyway, I'm naturally going to be approaching this from a predominantly queer angle, since that's the area I've done the most reading and thinking about, but do bear in mind that many of these ideas apply to a lot of other groups too. Part 1. The good. Let's begin by exploring ideas of identity. Who we are and what makes us us. The factors that shape and mould us into the people we are and become in life. This is going to get a bit deeper and more philosophical than I usually do on this channel, but I'll throw some links in the description to the people whose works I'm using as a jumping off point, who explain the ideas to me in a way that made sense, who were, frankly, actually qualified to talk philosophy. There's a couple of videos there by Abigail Thorne, aka PhilosophyTube. The first video is quite literally her video coming out as trans, in which she explores the work of Audre Lorde. I won't retrace her analysis in depth, but I will recommend you check out her stuff if you don't already know it. It's certainly been influential for me in the content I make, even if I can only aspire to her level of production values. The thrust of her analysis is that our identities don't exist in a bubble. They are shaped and guided by other people. Much of what we learn and discover about ourselves comes from a spark of recognition in others. We see others, we hear about their experiences. Maybe a lot of times it doesn't resonate with us, but sometimes it will. Someone will tell you, I don't know, just to grab an example out of nowhere, in video games I always choose to play a female character because I can relate to them more. Some folks will react to that like, oh, that's me. Now there's also a non-trivial proportion of gamers who'll say, "Nuh-uh, I just want to look at a pretty arse instead of some dudes," and fine, whatever, fair I guess. I honestly think there's a greater than zero proportion of that crowd who are in a river in Egypt, but then that's what discovering your identity is all about. But to the Spider-Man pointing crowd, that's that spark of recognition that helps build and shape their identity. I actually specifically chose this example because it's genuinely a pretty common experience among trans folks. If you're trapped in a body and life you didn't choose, escaping to a world where you can choose is pretty great. I've joked before that Meroka Thornbrush, channel mascot, avatar, whatever, over here is my self-image. No, I'm obviously not a cat girl born in the wrong body, nyan. But I definitely feel more connection with her than any of a million burly, grizzled, oorah, cishet white dudes. I'll still pick a female character, even if it's a first-person game and I don't get to see my avatar much. and bonus brownie points for games that have a non-binary option too. Not that there's a lot of those. And on the point of relating to video game characters, I don't actually think seeing elements of yourself reflected in fictional characters is any less valid. Those characters, no matter how fantastical, still have their own identities, still undergo experiences, and still process them in relatable ways. At the end of the day, they're written by other human beings wanting to share those things and ideas with other people. So if the mechanism by which we learn about ourselves is primarily through learning about other people's experiences, whether fictional or otherwise, then hopefully you can begin to see why having a diverse range of viewpoints matters. Why representation matters. If the only viewpoints we get to see and hear from are what society's labelled quote-unquote normal, white, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied, neurotypical, then it becomes that much harder for anyone who doesn't fit that specific mould to make sense of their lives. That's on an individual, personal level, but there's another bigger level to this, which is how representation affects society more broadly. Media has a profound impact on how we all perceive the world, and I use the word media here to encompass all forms of art, culture and entertainment, not just stuff like the news. I feel like there's an instinctive reaction from a certain crowd to that, to say, well, RIP you, but I'm different, I'm not a sheep like you. But I don't believe that's true. I think everyone is influenced whether they know it or not. And I have a fun little story that illustrates my point super well. Part 2. The Bad. Let's look at the word Nimrod. What does it mean? Idiot, dim-witted, slow, something like that, yeah? Let's look at the origin of that word. Nimrod was a biblical figure, a great and powerful hunter. How did his name come to mean idiot? Well, was he an idiot? Nope, not by any official accounts. The etymology is actually a lot more recent than that. We have to jump forward to 1932 to get the new meaning. Bugs Bunny. Bugs goddamn Bunny, of all people, gave Nimrod its new definition. He called Elmer Fudd Nimrod, in reference to the great biblical hunter. Elmer being a hunter, but not exactly great and powerful, the name was intended to be ironic. Looney Tunes' intended audience were probably not quite as well versed in the details of relatively minor biblical figures as the writers, and this irony was completely lost on them. Without that, one has to divine the meaning from context, and, well, Elmer Fudd is an idiot. So that's what Nimrod must mean. I love this because it's such a mundane and inconsequential thing. The word is basically archaic now anyway, but it's also a well-documented example of media, a kid's cartoon, shaping our understanding and perception of the world around us, within living memory no less. So of course we're influenced by the things we see, hear and read. It's just that the overwhelming majority of the time, you'll never know it's happening and it just kind of gets absorbed into the collective consciousness. An even simpler point I could make here is that if media couldn't influence anyone, product placement wouldn't work. And if it didn't work, it wouldn't exist. QED. So then if media can impact the world around us, and it does, then it follows that how it portrays things is just as important as what it portrays. This is to say that there are good and bad kinds of representation. We're going to have a look at a few, so consider this your content warning. Some of these are not great. So if you don't want to see a bunch of bigotry encoded into TV and film, skip ahead to 26 minutes and 27 seconds, and we'll have a look at the good stuff. But first, let's take a look at James Bond. I feel like it's a good jumping off point, partly because I've been watching them recently for, I guess, something vaguely like research purposes, and also because it's something we're basically all at least familiar with. It's a huge global film franchise, and everyone grew up with it. It started in the 60s, so the boomers watched them, and it's still going today, so everyone else did too. Just a pop cultural vertical slice of the past 60 years. And James Bond did a real number representing everyone badly. Everyone except cishet able-bodied white dudes anyway. Gay people? Evil to be murdered. Lesbians? Evil to be either murdered...
You're a fine-looking girl.
Or, raped into being both straight and good.
By the way, what made her call Washington? I must have appealed to her maternal instincts.
What message is that sending to our impressionable young boomers? Black people? Simple-minded, deeply superstitious people?
It don't do for a man to tempt Providence too often. You see, there's a dragon.
What?
Or, as was the focus of an entire movie, collectively an international conspiratorial drug-running network.
He's had known end.
People with disabilities or disfigurements? Wow, what can I say but yikes. Always, without fail, villains and henchmen. And often their disabilities being portrayed as their motivation for villainy.
Tell me, does the toppling of American missiles really compensate for having no hands?
And then there's the portrayal of so many different cultures.
It seems we've come on the wrong night. Two girls in love with the same man have threatened to kill each other. It must be settled the gypsy way.
In Japan, men always come first. Women come second.
I might just retire to here.
I tell them you're not Russian. They'll not kill you now.
Not now? How about later?
Don't worry. I'll save you for the harem.
But that's just one franchise. One I feel qualified to talk about. One big and influential franchise, but still not indicative of broader trends. When we're talking about inclusion and broader trends, a fun thing to think about is the Bechtel Test. Coined by cartoonist Alison Bechtel in 1985, the test checks a movie, or I guess you can trivially apply it to any other medium, to see whether it has 1. More than one named female character in it. 2. Who talk to each other at least once. 3. About anything other than a man. And it's pretty shocking to start applying it to things, and realising what a low proportion of things pass the test. There's a few websites out there tracking such things with varying degrees of completeness, but a fun one I found listed the top 250 movies on IMDb, as of 2010 at any rate, and only listed 60 which passed. That's less than a quarter. Is the Bechdel test a measure of anything at all? Well, no. But it's definitely an interesting thought experiment to look at how things are framed. It surely says something about movies that over 3/4 either don't feature women in any meaningful way or only do so for the men in them. If you want to look at a more recent sample rather than all the movies ever, which obviously gets skewed by historic data, another source claimed that only half of the top movies in 2016 passed the test. The Centre for the Study of Women in Television and Film releases a report every year analysing portrayals of characters in film. There's not one for 2021 yet, but we can look at the 2020 data. In 2020, only 29% of film protagonists were female, versus 49% men and 22% an ensemble. 62% of major characters were male, and only 38% female. There's a slow trend towards equality over the years, but it's a pretty poor representation of a demographic that makes up slightly more than half of the global population. And if women have the Bechdel test as a broad-stroke gauge of their representation, queer people have an equivalent. The Vito-Russo test, which pretty obviously takes its inspiration from the Bechdel test before it, and assesses works based on a similar rule system. The work must have at least one identifiably LGBT+ character in it, that character must not be defined solely by being queer, and the character must be relevant enough that their removal would impact the plot in some meaningful way. According to GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, 20% of movies in 2020 passed this test, which is a marked improvement on 8% as recently as 2017. Also, like the Bechdel test before it is of course interesting to note that the test doesn't particularly assess whether the representation is good or bad, just whether it's there and more than tokenism. Because two draggers kicking and screaming back to James Bond because it's all I know how to do, From Russia with Love,
A real labor of love.
Goldfinger,
You can turn off the charm. I'm immune.
and Diamonds Are Forever all pass the test. All the queer characters are not defined by that trait, given us how they're all also villains, but in addition, by being villains, they're pretty important to how events unfold, and yet their representation is a downright poisonous kind. I'd like to hope that in the year of our Lord 2021 we've moved beyond portraying queer as synonymous with sinister, and that the Vito-Russo test is a bit more useful in a modern context, but it is important to note its limitations. I suppose an interesting question to ponder as a follow-up is how much queer representation should there be? Not in the sense of the people who shriek about having the gay agenda rammed down their throats. Bunch of snowflakes. Rather more to look at populations, you'd potentially expect the characters shown in media to be roughly reflective of the real world, more or less, right? In developed nations, there tend to be slightly more women than men across the population. This is a verifiable fact that makes it all the more odd to see only 38% of characters in film being women. So, how many queer people are there? Well, it depends who you ask, how you ask, and what you ask. I'm going to look at the UK, because why shouldn't I? It's my damn country. And 67 million is a good sample size. I found this page from the Office of National Statistics saying the proportion of lesbian, gay and bi people as of 2018 is 2.2%, with 0.6% other? Which is what? Pansexual people who reject the bisexual label? Don't know, this is not explored further at any rate. But since they're only surveying sexual orientation, that by definition excludes trans folk who identify as straight. And the official stance of the ONS is to not keep track of how many trans people there are. So that's fun, and yet somehow incredibly expected here on Normal Island. What I do note is that 2.8% strikes me as unusually low, actually. 2.5% of people refuse to answer as well, so I don't know if that's people in the closet or just obstinate about government surveys, but sure, I can definitely understand not wanting to tell the British government your personal details. As a contrast to this figure, my next completely unverifiable source is that I distinctly remember being told in school that gay people accounted for somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 8 people, so like 10 to 12%. Now a brief interlude. We'll circle back around to this riveting statistical analysis, but if we're going to talk about the British education system, we need to talk about Section 28. Queer viewers, and especially queer British viewers, will quite rightly be incensed at the mention, because it was one of the most damaging pieces of legislation enacted against the queer community in modern times. Margaret fucking Thatcher.
Well, really, Mr. Bond.
There's plenty of valid reasons to hate her, but this is a really good one. In 1988, it was her government which passed the excitingly titled Local Government Act 1988, Section 28 of which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities, and even more specifically, a local authority shall not promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. There's arguably the most microscopic amount of wiggle room to talk about the existence of gay people without quote-unquote promoting homosexuality or its quote-unquote acceptability, but no teacher would take that chance. And if gay and lesbian people are out, bi people aren't getting a look in. Trans people don't make me laugh. Section 28 was upheld a full 15 years until 2003, and even then its effects lingered. Big middle-fingered shout-out to my recent home of 3 years, Kent, for keeping its own local version in place for another 7 years, until even that was finally put to bed with the Equality Act 2010. And even then, a study by LGBT plus rights group Stonewall in 2014 showed that 37% of primary school teachers and 29% of secondary school teachers still weren't sure if they were allowed to teach LGBT plus issues in school. So yeah, Margaret fucking Thatcher ensured a full generation of kids grew up with barely any knowledge that LGBT plus people even existed outside of what they learned from their families or gleaned from the media. Fuck her and fuck her government. Linking us neatly back to our original topic of identity, how is anyone supposed to figure out their identity if they've got nothing to go on? So that's the context in which I'm slightly surprised that in the mid-noughties, I honestly think it would have been within a year of the repeal of Section 28, we were taught that 10% of the population was gay. I don't think the idea of there being any more complexity to it than gay or straight was even on the table at that point. We were also taught that anal sex is dangerous, so, you know, be careful, gays. All of this naturally to much adolescent snickering. And speculation. If 10% is gay, and there's 30 people here, then who is it? Because nobody was out, not one person. because in an era of minimal representation and negligible education on the subject, in the British schooling system, to be out was to be bullied. And that's assuming you've even got it all figured out in the first place to have anything to come out about. 2 guys in my class only came out as gay in university, and it took me another decade or more to join the dots. Look, I'm not bisexual, I just think some guys are kind of attractive, okay? Oh. Well, that is 10% of my class of 30 accounted for then, and merely among the people I know about. I didn't keep in touch with many of them. On top of that, who's to say who's closeted, or in denial, or just repressed everything because of societal pressures? All too often we hear stories of people coming out later in life because they didn't feel they could do so earlier. It's always fun to hear the hysterical conspiracy theory that people are being transed. Even J.K. Rowling included it in her big transphobic essay. Like there's a secret cabal who's stolen all the Muslimic ray guns and set phasers to trans so they can go around transing the kids. No, it's literally just that people feel more comfortable coming out. Because of representation. Anyway, while we're already here, let's have another grim detour through the British noughties to see what factors might be leading kids to bully each other into being closeted or oppressed. Say, what's on TV? What's the big new hit show that everyone's watching and talking about on the playground? Oh, it's this thing called Little Britain. Aired on our delightful national broadcaster, the BBC, from 2003 to 2007, it ran for 3 seasons and 44 episodes. The brainchild of 2 privileged private school white guys, Matt Lucas and David Williams, it leans extremely heavily on punching down. How do they portray disabled people? Faking it for attention.
I'm here with a friend who may think is in a wheelchair, and I need a little bit of help getting him in and out of the pool.
Gay people? Faking it for attention.
No, you are not the gay. I am the gay. You're probably just a little bit puffy.
Working class youth. Unintelligible is, I guess, what this is.
No, because what happened was this whole thing happened, what I didn't even know nothing about, because Ashley Kramer's been going around saying that Samantha's brother smells of mud. But anyway, Shab never even stole no car, so Shab.
Trans? Oh, this is the one I really hate. Deluded, unconvincing crossdressers.
I'm a lady, you see. Please, pay me no heed. I've never been in a pub before.
I hate this because it's very likely the first trans representation in media that many of my generation will have been exposed to. Of course, Section 28 made sure none of us had even heard of trans people, so here you go, here's a nasty trans caricature to base your formative ideas off of. In a very real sense, that's actually the crux of it. When dealing with people, cultures, and identities we're unfamiliar with, how the media portrays them is oftentimes all people will have to go on. Many of Little Britain's so-called jokes, and all of their most parroted ones, just take those problematic ideas that sometimes bubble to the surface, and I suspect more people have than would admit, especially the disabled one. How many times have you heard people's disabilities dismissed or rubbished? Oh, you don't look disabled. I bet you don't really need that wheelchair. And it tells everyone, it's okay, that's funny, we're all thinking it, here's a laugh track just to reinforce it. And you know what? Hand up. I thought it was funny at the time too. I was an edgy, shitty, problematic 16-year-old. But we learn and grow, hopefully. Lucas did apologise for the show in 2017, and the pair apologised specifically for the blackface bits, because, oh yeah, they did blackface too, when their show got pulled from streaming platforms last year. But also last year they reprised the trans characters during a BBC special, so maybe we don't all learn and grow. Right, so back to the numbers. I was looking for stats on the prevalence of minority identities which have been systematically suppressed. Because of that, I think whatever figure you come to will always be an underestimate. My unscientific vibes-based hypothesis is that the most representative figures are likely to be found from looking at Gen Z. That's folks born from 1997 onwards. They've grown up in a post-Section 28 era, and even outside the UK, attitudes have moved in the same direction at roughly the same pace, among developed nations at any rate. Look at same-sex marriage. I don't know that there's too much to read into it, but it seems like a pretty good yardstick to measure LGBT plus acceptance by, and from 2010 onwards the tide has shifted much more in favour of it. Looking at Gen Z alone, I would even still say any estimates are likely to be on the low side, since there are so many factors involved in any one person's decision to come out. Gen Z folk obviously still have older family who may be a lot less tolerant of such things. How you anticipate those closest to you reacting to the news is a huge factor for anyone. But, working on my assumption that Gen Z is the most representative sample, how many of them identify as queer? A Gallup poll from February this year shows 15.9% of American Gen Z adults identifying as LGBT. GLAAD, in the same study we looked at earlier, claims a figure of 20% among 18 to 34-year-olds, albeit in a study with a smaller sample size. Disappointingly, the US 2020 census doesn't appear to have asked for sexual orientation or gender identity data as far as I can make out. On the other hand, the 2021 UK census definitely did, in spite of a brief furore with the transphobes about the wording, so that should be interesting to see when the results are made available next year. And it will still be an underestimate because not everyone will be comfortable disclosing that information. So here in the Vibes Laboratory, I'm pretty content to accept the true figure as likely sitting somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6. In a hypothetical, ideal world, where everyone was equipped to figure out their own identities and could do so without fear of abuse, being fired, disowned, or murdered, I think we'd see roughly that many queer people. But hey, that's just a theory. A queer theory. Which is mostly my rebuttal to the idea that queer identities are overrepresented and the gay trans agenda is being shoved down our throats. Nope, there are genuinely loads of us out there, and the next Doctor Who should be non-binary, partly because it would be hella awesome to have that representation, but mainly to trigger the fash. Right, that's why representation matters, and that's why bad representation is harmful. I could dig deeper into more examples, but I think we're depressed enough now. Let's put the bad stuff away and look at good representation. Part 3. The Fabulous. I'm sure I won't be able to cover half the stuff I want to, or even a tiny iota of the stuff I should, but I'm going to list some of the representation that's been most important to me, even if I didn't realise it at the time for a few of them. In fact, let's begin with one of those ones I didn't appreciate because it allows me to drag you all back to Britain again, which I know you all love. It's so normal here. Coronation Street is a goddamn British institution, a cornerstone of British culture. It's a soap opera. Do you get those elsewhere? Okay, Wikipedia tells me you do, but it's something that feels powerfully British. Probably because of Coronation Street. It's the longest running televised soap opera. It's older than the James Bond movies, and it engages the television-watching generations of this sceptred isle 6 times a week. Oh, and then it's exported all over the world too. All of which to say is it's punching well above its weight in terms of cultural influence. Which is why it's significant that in 1998, the show introduced a transgender character, Hayley Cropper. Hayley obviously went through all the usual soap opera ordeals, kidnapping, murder, explosions, etc., etc., all of which, of course, pales in comparison to dealing with a gender identity clinic. But importantly, she showed audiences the regular struggles in the life of a trans person, and even more so that in all important respects they're basically just like cis people, not some weird alien species. So impactful was Hayley's character that her portrayal led to the UK's Gender Recognition Act being passed in 2004. Alright, all I have on that is an uncited Wikipedia reference, and I really doubt I can trace a direct causal link there, but it's a good story, okay? And yeah, the GRA has definite issues, but it's still a big deal. Hayley remained on the street bringing positive trans representation to Turf Island multiple times a week for fully 15 years, and that's extremely commendable. Bit of an obscure one next. A character from, goddammit, British author Alistair Reynolds. A science fiction writer, new space opera if you want to get specific. I've enjoyed his works for many years. Matter of fact, my online handle is straight up nicked from a character in one of his books. But he nicked it from a gun on a Spanish naval vessel, so I think it's fine. Science fiction, I think, can be a powerful tool for envisioning inclusive, progressive ideas for the future of society. Reynolds' works routinely feature depictions of the future in which disadvantaged minorities hold positions of political and corporate power. To single out the Poseidon's Children trilogy of books in particular, the events take place in a post-climate crisis era in which China, India, and a united Africa are now dominant world superpowers. Many of the protagonists are from an African corporate family with a matriarchal power structure. There's a lesbian couple who are integral to the third book, but their sexuality isn't really an important point, it's just a part of their life. So it passes the Vito Russo test. What's really interesting to me, though, is that the second book features a non-binary character. A little bit of a background character, nonetheless named, who uses we/her pronouns. It's an interesting inclusion because, much like the lesbian couple, nothing is made of this fact. It's the 24th century. People have neopronouns. It's so normal that it's not even worth remarking on. No one ever says, oh yeah, V's non-binary and here's what that means. people mention Ver and carry on with the plot. Except I'm reading this in 2013 and haven't really encountered it before, and it just feels a bit weird. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one. And if it gets people to dig a bit deeper and learn something about other people they might not have previously understood, then I'm inclined to think that it might be a good thing. And non-binary representation in media is pretty damn rare. Maybe a whisper less so now, but vanishingly so in 2013 for sure. I don't think neopronouns like Viva Viz ever really caught on, honestly. I found a pronoun use website while making sure I knew how to use them correctly for this video, which listed a grand total of 5 books by 4 authors which use them in some capacity, including this one. Some folks do use neopronouns like Viva, but they do feel a bit unwieldy even to me. I'm sure entirely because we're not familiar with them and they take a bit of practice and learning to get used to, whereas we already use they, them in everyday speech and know how to use those words naturally in sentences, so it's a lot easier to pick up. I guess the more militant folks in the queer community might argue that that's prioritising other people's comfort over your own identity. Personally, I will try to use neopronouns if it's someone's preference, but have to acknowledge that I'm likely to make mistakes, and honestly think so will the vast majority of people without it seeing more widespread use. Also, it's worth asking that if the character isn't a major character and their queerness isn't especially relevant to the story, then is that just tokenism? On the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, it's, as I say, an idealised version of the future, where trans, non-binary, or other queer identities are wholly unremarkable, which is really all anyone's asking for. I'm trans, so what? Leave me alone. My identity doesn't affect you, so stop trying to debate my existence. There's definitely scope for discussion about tokenism and the commercialisation of queer identities. Star Trek Discovery introduced both a non-binary and trans character last year. Some folks derided this decision as having been made simply to sell more Star Trek to queer audiences. But even if it is true, does that invalidate anyone wanting to be excited about that sort of inclusion? There's probably a whole video's content in that alone, so we won't dig too deep right now. Okay, let's turn our gaze to the internet, and to that spark of recognition that helps us understand our identity, which we looked at in part 1. The internet has given anyone with modest tools and equipment the ability to have a much louder voice than they ever would otherwise, and as such has been a powerful tool in pushing queer acceptance and rights. Marginalised groups can find a platform to share their experiences, their feelings, and communicate their ideas to the world much more easily. And right here on youtube.co.uk is no exception. So here's a few influencers who've been important to me. Oh shit, they're all British, aren't they? It's just a coincidence, I swear! We keep circling around to that Audre Lorde discussion on identity, so it'll come as no surprise that those Abigail Thorne videos have had a significant impact on me personally. But we need to go deeper. Abby herself cites another leftist video maker, Harry Brewis, aka H-Bomber Guy, in being instrumental in figuring out her own identity. Being someone assigned male at birth, and of a similar age to myself, she likewise had relatable experiences growing up in a Section 28 era, and being denied that representation that would have allowed her to figure things out sooner. Brewis coming out as bisexual provided that spark of recognition for her that said, oh, actually people that look like me, at the time, can be queer. Queer can be a label that applies to me. These videos and other discussions had me pondering my own identity for far longer than I'd ever done previously. A lot of trans women's experiences seemed very relatable to me, but the idea of being a woman didn't quite seem to fit. Enter James Stephanie Sterling, famous for the Jimquisition. Snarky, cynical British video game reviewer and content creator. How could I not find them relatable? As an aside, I swear I'm not entirely intentionally ripping off their style of video, but hot damn does it look like it sometimes. We use the same stock footage website, which really doesn't help. Anyway, they came out as non-binary a little over a year ago, which really helped me figure out all the stuff I'd been pondering over. Here was somebody that I saw being quite a lot like me, albeit far more talented and successful, saying, I'm trans, but not a trans woman, just some mess of gender somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. Seeing someone like me wearing the label non-binary was meaningful. They seemed much happier for it, and when I tried applying the label to myself, I found I quite liked it too. So I guess that's my point. Representation can come from anywhere. It's not just works of fiction, and anyone can be that representation too. Which is why I think it's important for me to make this video, because maybe there's a chance that someone out there is watching this trying to figure out why they don't feel like they fit into the role they've been told to in life, and it's because they've never seen themselves represented before. Hi, I'm Meroka, I'm non-binary, and my pronouns are they and them. I won't police you if you misgender me though, I have Tolkis to do that for me. Dang, we got this far and I've scarcely mentioned video games. We've talked plenty on movies, TV, books, and even influencers. But this is a video game channel, so I'm legally obliged to mention video games at least a little bit on pain of lynching. With that in mind, here's all the games I've found so far that I really like, or which I think are noteworthy, which feature non-binary characters or character creation options. Temtem. I touched on this momentarily earlier, and made a whole video on its approach to the subject of gender last year. It has masculine and feminine body types in the character creator, with he, him, she, her, and they, them pronoun options that you can mix and match as you desire. There's no constraints on hairstyles and clothing, so you can pick those as you desire too. I picked they, them pronouns when we started playing this nearly 2 years ago now. Ooh, is it that long? Wanna feel old? Temtem has been around for 2 years. Anyway, yeah, that should give you an idea how long I've been thinking about this stuff. What can I say, I'm a late bloomer. It also has a bunch of sometimes slightly ham-fisted and sometimes adorable, but nonetheless appreciated trans and non-binary stuff going on with NPCs. Temtem's rad, go play it. Boyfriend Dungeon. Not my favourite game of 2021, I had high hopes for it and it fell a little flat, but an entertaining romp regardless. It has non-binary character creation options, as well as non-binary romanceable characters. It's very much been crafted with inclusivity as a significant focus, and should be commended for that. Moonglow Bay. Non-binary character creation options, non-binary options for your character's partner, and at least one NB villager that I've met so far. Basically everything I said about Boyfriend Dungeon applies here too, sadly including the bit about it not captivating me quite as much as I'd hoped it might. Huzzlecat. Not actually a game I played if I'm honest, but I watched a Let's Play of it, then bought it, and still didn't play it, like the rest of my tragic Steam library. A visual novel from 2016, and one of the earliest examples I've found of non-binary player options. You get to pick from a number of decidedly gender non-specific avatar options, and you can choose to be referred to with they-them pronouns. Very charming, has lots of cute cats, recommended. Murder by Numbers. Okay, this doesn't actually have specifically MB representation, or even strictly trans representation in it, but there's an entire chapter, quarter of the game, set in a drag club, and it tackles the subject in a very respectful way, but also without it being the main focus of things. It's just a very cool theme for the level. And the protagonist is a strong, capable black woman, and her BFF is openly gay, so yay for even more awesome rep. I really enjoyed Murder by Numbers, heartily recommended. Dominique Pamplemousse. That's really satisfying to say. Created by solo non-binary game dev Squinky. It's an artsy point-and-click detective game made with claymation and presented in black and white. Themes of gender, among other social issues, are discussed frequently. Perhaps too frequently for some critics, but at its essence Dominique Pamplemousse is first and foremost a way for the dev to express themselves. The grey blob is a metaphor for gender. Are we not all grey blobs after all? No? Oh, okay, fine. Diaries of a Spaceport Janitor. A weird game about making a living picking up trash in an alien city. Your character has a condition, I guess it's gender dysphoria, wherein they need to buy an item at regular intervals to change gender, or else they suffer a debuff. The genders are always something surreal, it's a bit like that Twitter account Gender of the Day, and they do nothing, it's just flavor text, you never actually look different. I've got to say, it feels very close to simply being an attack helicopter type of piss take, but the developers have stated that the game was born out of a pushback against Gamergate, so I think it's safe to say it's just genderqueer fun. Later Daters, a visual novel about sex and romance in a retirement home. It's definitely tackling a subject that makes people uncomfortable, but if you can deal with the fact that old people have sex, and any revulsion you might have is a you problem, then it's a story with an extremely diverse and well-represented cast. If you pick non-binary character creation options, it even adds some extra conversations about the matter into the game. My biggest gripe is that the idea of having so many queer retirees in one room together stretches the limits of plausibility for me, but that's whatever. That's what storytelling is for. Spiral Knights. I don't know if there's any real intent here other than to keep things simple, but everyone's an androgynous blob and gender doesn't particularly exist on Haven. Some armor styles are kind of masculine, some are kind of feminine, but not by much. The most gendered items in the game are the summer-themed cosmetic items, a pair of swim shorts and a sarong. Oh, and to the person who once upon a time asked me, when I bought said sarong, "Are you trans?" and I said, "No, I just like to feel cute sometimes." Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I might need to reconsider my answer. Sea of Thieves. Ooh, controversial choice? Maybe. Okay, hear me out. Pirates traditionally have got a definite connection with gender non-conformity. Tales abound of women dressing as men in order to join crews, Anne Bonny and Mary Read being just two of the most famous examples. More specifically to the game, Sea of Thieves characters can all be dressed up in whatever you want. Feminine bodies can have beards, masculine bodies can wear a skirt. My headcanon for my own avatar is that he's transmasc. I know multiple players who created female characters and didn't realise until well after the fact that that's what they'd done, because there's a certain gender non-specificity to an unkempt, scruffy sea dog. And it has to be noted that there's a surprising number of ostensibly male avatars running around in dresses. Sea of Thieves, super genderqueer. This is a hill I will die on. No Longer Home. Another game by NBs about NBs. A narrative game following a couple of NB friends as they leave college. I've unfortunately got to say it never entirely grabbed me, but it has been very well received by others, and I do feel like I need to give it a second chance. Monster Prom and Monster Camp. Short, very silly, very replayable, competitive multiplayer dating sim. Yeah, you heard me. It has they/them pronouns for your character. I mean, I guess gender and sexuality are all just kind of whatever in a world of werewolves, mermaids, demons, and a million other things. I would have played a buttload more of it on this channel if Tulkas wasn't still salty about Fixer ruining his date with the werewolf. Quick, lightning round.
He seems okay, but he is being burned internally.
Other excellent rep I want to recommend. Lake, the protagonist is bi and has a super cute lesbian relationship. Stardew Valley, cozy AF, date anyone, there are no rules. Always Sometimes Monsters, terrifyingly complex RPG maker-based story where you can have a same-sex relationship. It was my game of the year in 2014, go play it. Valhalla, the protagonist is a lesbian, I made it my game of the year in 2016, go play it. Hades, the son of the god of the dead, is an awkward pansexual, it was my game of the year 2020, go play it. Paradise Killer, the protagonist is bi, again, and it's the best thing I played this year, go play it. And 3 TV shows I wanted to mention but couldn't shoehorn in. Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Rosa is bi, she has a whole story arc where her parents come to accept it, it's sweet. Disenchanted, Matt Groening's newest show on Netflix, the protagonist is bi, and it's all entertainingly progressive. Alice in Borderland, Netflix adaptation of a Battle Royale-inspired manga. One of the main characters is a trans woman, and they do a great job of making her very cool and likeable long before you get to know her past, and they don't even kill her off. Woo! I've been talking far longer than I'm usually even capable of in these videos, but it's a subject that, as I hope you've gleaned, important to me and so many other people. And also it's going to be a pain in the ass to edit this video, so I'm going to stop before I make the job impossible. I obviously don't know all the games out there with non-binary representation in them, so if you have any you'd recommend, let me know in the comments. Or heck, actually just any really positive rep for any marginalised group. Share the love, share cool stuff that's not just about cishet white dudes. By contrast, this is also a subject that can attract just the fucking worst people. So let me just remind you that a fundamental rule of my online community is that bigotry is completely unacceptable and I'll be removing any hate speech I find, and banning you from commenting, obviously. Lastly, just to bring things full circle, back to me being the subject, as it should be, a reminder that if you're talking about me, I'd prefer you use they/them pronouns, and I'm not super stoked about being referred to in a masculine context. I'm not going to be policing anyone, but know that
your name will go on the list
of people who couldn't be bothered to make the effort, and I'm just disappointed in you. And really, that's the most British thing of all. Disappointment. Okay, I don't want to end it on a totally bum note, so know that I'm super stoked to finally be out of the closet and hope you're supportive on me. Do you know who is supportive? My channel buccaneers. Thanks to Weirter and Talkers for supporting my channel at the $5 membership tier. You can join their glorious ranks by hitting the join button below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.